Lesson 2. This covers the legal aspects of driving the ambulance. I know a lot of times we kind of consider the legal stuff to be some of the boring stuff, but this is actually a real important part of what we're doing with EVOC. You have to be able to drive safely. If you drive safely, you won't have a wreck, and hopefully you won't have to worry about legal aspects. So as an ambulance operator, you're responsible for the safe and efficient transportation of your patients and crew. You must also be aware and look out for the safety of the public. The very nature of the job that we do requires us to work with others during a time of crisis, and with this comes certain risks. You need to be aware that at all times, while performing your job, you're being held legally accountable for your actions. So in this section, we're going to talk about different types of laws and define them and see how they apply to us. So there's 4 basic types of laws that we need to be familiar with: constitutional law, statutory law, ordinances, and rules and regulations. Sometimes we call the rules and regulations standard operating procedures. So constitutional law are things that are guaranteed as rights in our Constitution, like freedom of speech, right to bear arms, freedom from religious persecution. Those are all constitutional laws. Now, statutory laws, there are federal and there are state statutory laws, but these are things that are written in a code. So things like murder, rape, arson, vehicular homicide, those sorts of things are statutory law. And while you may do something like if you were to create some meth and then transport it across state lines, then you might deal with both things like Alabama and Mississippi statutory law, but because you went across state lines, you may also run afoul of a federal statutory law. But these aren't things that are defined in the Constitution. Ordinances are things that cities come up with, and most of the times these deals with things like noise ordinances. You can't be above a certain decibel in your car, or how many pets can you have at home, or do dogs need to be on leashes, things like that. And then rules and regulations are things that your ambulance service defines. So if you think about like driving, when you're in an emergency mode, you can drive, you have an exemption that you can drive as fast as you want. However, most ambulance services say you can drive no more than 10 miles an hour over the posted speed limit. So that would be a standard operating procedure. Another SOP or rules or regulation would be something like at the beginning of every shift, you have to check your truck and complete a truck checklist. These things must work together. So things like federal policies must interact with state and local policies, and your organizational guidelines have to work with them too. So you're looking for the sweet spot in the middle. And one of the things that something like an SOP cannot do is it cannot override a state law or federal law or a constitutional law. So that's why we have things like if we take someone without consent, it's false imprisonment. I could not write a standard operating procedure or an organizational guideline that says every patient you come into contact with, you must transport to the hospital. Because then if I take someone against their will, I've falsely imprisoned them and kidnapped them, and we can't have that. So what does Alabama require? To start with, you have to have a regular driver's license, and it doesn't have to be from Alabama. So if you're from Tennessee or Mississippi and you're taking this course and you want to work in Alabama, that's fine. You just have to have a driver's license from the state you live in. It has to be fairly good or clean, not too many points on it, and it says you have to be 21 or 19 with no moving violations. There's been a little bit of pushback on that, and I think we've gotten some people in under the age of 19, but again, you had to have pretty good driver's records with that, and a lot of this would depend on the insurance company's policies. And different ambulance services with different insurance companies have different policies on that. Of course, you have to be familiar with how to operate a vehicle, and that's why you're taking this course. You have to have good eyesight, at least in one eye. You have to have CPR. You have to go through the EVOC course. You have to be an EMR, emergency medical responder, and you have to have at least a refresher class every 2 years. If you do have a wreck, like I mentioned in Module 1 or Lesson 1, if you do have a wreck or moving violation or something like that, you do have to report it to the state. Regional EMS agency, which is North Alabama EMS Region 1 for us, and also have to report it to the service that you work for. There are a few things that they will not give you an EVOC license for. If you've had vehicular homicide, you have a DUI in the last 5 years, or if you've had some drugs or other drug paraphernalia in the last 5 years, that probably will not. Again, please don't come ask me. I don't want to know. Don't tell me. If you tell me, then I'll have to do something about it. So don't come ask me. Just let that happen at the state level and with your individual ambulance services insurance company. If you've had such a poor driving record, you've had so many moving violations, you've run too many stop signs, you've sped too much, you've got too many tickets, and you've had to give up your license, you probably won't be driving an ambulance. And if you did have your license revoked and you continue to drive and you got busted one more time, then you would not, again, have your be able to get an ambulance driver's license. Another one here is, sounds kind of silly, convicted of being under the influence of alcohol or a controlled substance while operating an emergency vehicle. There was actually a case of this somewhere down south, I think Virginia, where one of the EMTs for a volunteer ambulance service turned 21, and they had a big party at one of the local taverns, and then after enjoying themselves way too much at the tavern, they decided it would be fun to go get in one of the ambulances and drive around town with the lights on and whoop it up and continue the party in the ambulance. So when they got pulled over, they all got arrested. And obviously, if you did something like that, you would not be driving the ambulance again. So when we're looking at all these laws that are out there, we need to figure out when the laws apply to us and when am I exempt from the law. And the term exemption is something very specific for us, and we'll talk about that in a later slide. So again, all these things have to work together. I cannot write an SOP that overrides constitutional, federal, state law, or even municipal laws. So if there was something in the municipal laws, although I don't know if they could come up with something like that, I can't violate that. I have to work together. So when you're driving the ambulance in non-emergency mode, you are just like any other vehicle out there. You're not exempt from anything. You have to follow all the same rules, regulations, laws that you do when you drive your personal vehicle. We have an exception for that when there is an exemption. And an exemption means you may be able to do things that you could not do in your personal vehicle, like drive down the wrong way on a one-way street. However, if you are doing something and you still have a wreck, so maybe you're doing 55 and a 45 responding to emergency mode to a call, and if you are involved in a wreck, you might be legally allowed to do that, but just realize the family that you wrecked could sue you, so you might still be held civilly liable when you wreck the vehicle. So even though you're in emergency mode, and it may be legal for you to do that, you still have to drive safely because you might be civilly liable if you wreck it. Somebody can sue you. So there's three big ones that we talk about. We talk about due regard, true emergency, and negligence. So here's that term exemption again. And the definition for this is a specific exemption is a statement which appears in the statutes and specifies an exemption to the rule. So when we're running in emergency mode, we can do things like proceed through a red light, proceed through a stop sign without stopping. We can exceed the speed limit. We can drive the wrong way on a one-way street. We can drive the wrong way on a two-way street. You can go into oncoming traffic. Kind of dangerous, but we do that occasionally. We're trying to get around some stuff. It's always a trip to drive across like O'Neill Bridge on the wrong side, which occasionally we've had to do that with some sort of a wreck or something on it. We've had to get around to the other side. So these are things that we can do. In essence, there's really not a lot we can't do when we're in emergency mode. We just have to make sure we're doing it safely because we can still be held civilly liable. Now, emergency mode in Alabama is lights and sirens. There is no code 2 for ambulances, which would be lights only. So let's look at an example here. You're following another vehicle through an intersection. You're both using your emergency equipment, so you have your lights and sirens. Are you allowed to follow right behind the other vehicle? And the answer to that is actually yes, you are. You do not have to maintain the normal 400 to 500 feet back that you would behind an emergency vehicle if you were driving your car. However, that may not be the smartest thing to do, because a lot of people are watching, they hear the sirens, they see the fire truck come through, and then you follow right behind it, but they were looking at the fire truck and then they pull out in front of you. So it's still not a bad idea to give a pretty good space cushion there when you're following another emergency vehicle, even though you're legally allowed to follow pretty closely. This is happening, or this situation is happening more and more as we have police, fire, and EMS going to pretty much every EMS call now. So it's oftentimes true that we get right behind a fire truck and we kind of follow them to the scene. There's a video that's supposed to accompany this slide. I'll see if I can find it and attach it to the end of the presentation. It won't play in this particular presentation mode. All right, due regard. Due regard is kind of like the scope of practice in negligence, in that are you kind of doing things like other people would do it? If you're driving like your peers, and I don't want you to think like your peers, because there's some bad drivers out there. I want you to think about how your peers should be driving. So are you responding like you should be, or other people would? Would they be doing something similar? And if you go to court over this, they're going to look at the EVOC manual, they're going to come ask me, they're going to subpoena the presentations, they're going to see what we taught you. So if you're violating or deviating from what you learned in the class, you're probably not doing what you're supposed to do. Are you giving enough notice of your vehicle's approach? So if you're right up on the tail or on the bumper of somebody and you suddenly flip on the lights and sirens, and then they, in a moment of panic when all the noise hits them, they slam on the brakes and then you run into them, that would be your fault, not their fault. You didn't give them enough notice. So don't do that if you're immediately behind someone. Make sure you got a little bit of space there and give them some room to pull over. And I know we oftentimes say nobody ever seems to do the right thing, and that's really not true. If you put a dash cam out there and you were to look at most cars, most people will get out of the way, provided they know what to do. We just don't notice those that actually do what they're supposed to. We only notice those jerks that won't get out of our way. Are you using your lights and sirens appropriately? Meaning, is this a time that you've been dispatched on an emergency? Is it truly an emergency? And it's not just shift change, so you're trying to get back faster. And then always, 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 are you driving safely and using caution? So a true emergency is something that involves a high probability of death or serious injury, and this is an important thing, and driving emergency may reduce the seriousness of the situation. And these situations are actually very rare. And once we get on the scene and we start managing the patient, there are very few that saving a minute or two by running an emergency makes a difference. And emergency medical dispatch, priority dispatch, has done some studies on this and shows that in emergency mode inside of a city, we generally save about a minute, maybe two. I think they said 90 seconds was average. So does 90 seconds really truly make a difference in most of our calls? And probably 99% of them, no, it doesn't. There might be a couple of times, though. Cardiac arrest is one, because we know that the sooner we start CPR and the faster the defibrillator gets there, the better chance of survival. But once somebody has started CPR and once the defibrillator arrives, all the rest of us could actually slow down. Another one might be severe bleeding. If we can get bleeding controlled faster, we might save them. So that means some of our trauma situations might be true emergencies. But again, once you got the bleeding control, it's not such an emergency anymore. And even things like heart attacks and strokes, where we say time is muscle and time is brain, 90 seconds doesn't make a whole lot of difference in the great scheme of things. We can save 90 seconds somewhere else during our call and make that up. So there's really not a lot of times we need to be running an emergency. And there's a bit of a push, and I support it, of just taking the lights and the sirens off the ambulances. I think we end up hurting more people by being involved in wrecks running an emergency than we end up helping by running emergencies. But that's going to take another study and more investigation. Now, as far as who decides what is a true emergency, some places like dispatch, code systems. So if you call 911 and we dispatch an ambulance, it's going to be an emergency. What we've gotten to, though, is our dispatchers can hopefully question the caller a little bit and get some information, and they can, in I guess more sophisticated systems than what we have around here, they make a decision whether this is an emergency or non-emergency based on how these questions are answered, and that's what emergency medical dispatch, that training is all about. You go through these questions. Sometimes you use a computer, sometimes you use flip cards, but then they take that information and make a determination whether it's an emergency or not. And it's actually really accurate. There are a few exceptions, and we always seem to remember the exceptions versus the rules, but it's pretty darn accurate. Now, if you get somebody on scene and they say, hey, this is an emergency, you need to, I always love this, they need to step it up. It's like we have a button or something on our ambulance that makes us go faster. They might determine that's an emergency. More often than not, they arrive on scene and tell us we can slow down to non-emergency because it's really, truly not something that's life-threatening. And the other thing that we run into is like an interfacility transfer. So if I'm going from ECM to Birmingham, the physician there may have marked it as an emergency, which means I'm supposed to run emergency. A lot of doctors just automatically mark everything emergency because they're worried something could happen when they're not in the hospital, and they think that if we're running lights and sirens, we'll get there a whole lot faster and get them back in care of another doctor. And that's not really true, and sometimes running emergency, kind of as I stated earlier, I think the risk of being involved in a wreck and having damage is greater than whatever time we may save. So here's the official Alabama protocol on cancellation or slowdown and who can do it. You can look this up on Alabama Department of Public Health EMS website, download the protocols. I would recommend doing that so you have them with you. Many ambulance services print these out and have a copy of them in each ambulance, but you need to be familiar with the protocols. So negligence, remember that the standard of care is the care you should provide. Is only there if we have a duty to act, we breach that duty, somebody gets hurt, and we can prove that whatever the breach of the duty was caused the injury. And this is really kind of hard to do with medical situations, but it's really easy to do when you're driving an ambulance. So if I'm sitting in my car at a red light and you come up behind me running lights and sirens and I don't pull over, but you run into me, did you have a duty to drive safely? Yes. If you hit me, did you breach that duty? Yes. Was there neck and back pain afterwards? Yes. I didn't have it before, but I have it after. So can you show that there was a cause and effect there? Yes. Very easy to prove negligence when driving if you're in a wreck. So this is probably the most dangerous thing we do, both legally and just physically. So just realize that if you're involved in a wreck when you're running lights and sirens, there's a very good possibility that your service would be sued, and you might be sued individually. So here's an example. You got a young girl, injured arm, taking her to the hospital when it crashed with another vehicle. The ambulance operator was determined to be at fault. The injury or the wreck caused more injuries to the girl. Yes, you would be found negligent in that situation. And negligent is a civil thing. They would sue for pain and suffering and damages and all that. Now, abandonment. We talked about this back in chapter 3, 4, something like that, with medical legal issues. And this is either we're not going to take someone, we refuse to take them, or we start care and then stop care without a refusal or without transferring them to another healthcare provider. Now, this is not abandonment like you arrive on scene or you determine the scene is unsafe and you leave. That is not abandonment. Anytime the scene is unsafe and you leave, you are within your rights to do that. Sometimes we don't know that the scene isn't safe until we get there. Now, if you've actually started talking to the patient and you're interacting with the patient and you decide, you know what, I just don't want to do this, and you leave them there, you don't get a refusal signed, you don't take them to the hospital, that would be an abandonment situation. We sometimes run into this when we pick up some of our frequent flyers. We'll pick them up 4 or 5 times a week, and that 5th or 6th time, we're just like, nope, not taking you to the hospital, you're fine. And we don't even give them a chance to go through the refusal, or we don't take them, and then we could be abandoning the patient. Another time I see this is when we get to the emergency department and we drop a patient off, but we have another call waiting on us as soon as we can get clear. So we just tell the nurse, hey, we put them in bed 2, and then we run out the door, and we never got our patient care report signed by the nurse. Remember, it is your patient until 1, they're on the hospital stretcher, and 2, it's signed by the receiving healthcare provider. So make sure you get those signatures on every call. Good Samaritan in Alabama. Good Samaritan legislation protects licensed healthcare providers and the military during an emergency, like the National Guard. But even then, they cannot receive compensation, they cannot go outside their scope of practice, and they cannot do anything grossly negligent. So even if you're not a licensed healthcare provider, those are still 3 good rules to follow. Don't do anything you're not supposed to do, don't do anything that you know is wrong, and don't get any sort of gift card money, whatever, afterwards. We know about consent. In order to take care of a patient, we have to get consent. So they have to allow us to touch them and do things to them. That would be considered actual consent. Now, implied consent is when they're unconscious or unresponsive or not in their right mind, and we get to assume that if they were in their right mind, they would want medical care. So that would be implied consent. Now, every once in a while, we're on scene and the patient doesn't want to go to the hospital by ambulance. There's probably not a whole lot wrong with them. They really just don't want to go, and that's fine. They have the right to do that, but we want to make sure that we document things well and we get lots of signatures on both the witness and the patient to say that, yes, this is what actually happened, because if something goes wrong with the patient later, they may say that they wanted to go to the hospital, but you didn't want to take them. So you got to make sure you document things well with refusals. That's probably the second area, or the second most dangerous area for us. Here's the rights of the patients for our protocols. Again, look up the protocols in the protocol manual online, or download it, or you can even get an app that has our protocols in it and you can search through them. Remember, in Alabama and Alabama only, so don't think about this when you're taking care of or taking your national registry exam. In Alabama, we had to be 14 years of age or older, or have graduated high school, got married, or have been married and divorced, or is pregnant, or has a child, to give consent. Now, to get a refusal, they have to be 19. So we have a little bit of a gap there. So at 14, they can consent. At 19, they can refuse. As long as they're not emancipated. Again, for national registry purposes, I just want you to think 18 as adult. Here's some other things that we should do if we're getting a refusal. Things like contacting online medical direction, OLMD, and talk to the doctor and see if the doctor wants to talk to the patient. And most of the time, the doctor, every time I've done this, the doctor said, well, are they in the right mind? And I say, yep. And he said, well, they want to go? Nope. Well, then don't take them. So they don't always give me a lot of good advice, but that's the general gist of the conversation. But we do have to contact them. So make sure you call the physician and let her know what's going on, and then go through a little bit of a checklist to make sure the patient's in their right mind before you let them sign that refusal. Confidentiality is another area, and remember, we don't talk to the press, we don't talk to family, we don't talk to friends. We're really not even supposed to talk to the other crews about what we just ran, although you will see that happen a lot. We'll go back to the station, somebody else is there, and we'll say something about, oh yeah, we picked up Miss Jane again. Oh, what was wrong with her this time? Oh, well, her blood sugar got, and we just violated HIPAA all over the place with that. But you'll see that happen. Best thing to do is don't talk about any specifics. Not that we can't talk about a call, but nothing I can say or write or post can be traced back to a specific person. And on the radio, we try to avoid names and addresses as best we can, phone numbers, things like that, just because that information is probably being scanned by someone and they're listening to it at home, so we don't want to give away anything that may tie it back to a person. Especially because most, if not all, 911 communication is actually public record. So the stuff that gets recorded on the radio, this is why 911 calls show up on the news all the time. Unless there is a very specific reason to not allow that to be public information, the media can just request it and get it, and you don't want to be saying things on the radio that you shouldn't have been saying and have it show up on the 6 o'clock news. Some other things we have to worry about, any possessions that we take, and a lot of times we bring in a purse or a bag, especially if we're going from hospital A to hospital B. There's oftentimes bags of possessions that we take. Once you agree to take it, that's something else that we're held liable for. So we have to take care of that stuff, keep up with it. When things are valuable, large amounts of cash or jewelry, it's it's not a bad idea to put that in your PCR and let the nurse know about it, so when she signs, she's taking over responsibility of it, because I would hate for it to show up missing later and you be the one that get accused of taking it, which some ambulance personnel have done. If you get into a bunch of wrecks or a bunch of speeding tickets and you don't let your supervisor know, your insurance company may say that they are not liable anymore because you didn't follow the rules, you didn't report it to them, so you voided your coverage, which means all of the legal expenses become yours instead of the insurance company. If you don't check your truck at the beginning of the shift and you're missing a piece of equipment, or something breaks down and you hadn't inspected it and you didn't document it, then you can be held liable. City of Chicago had an issue a few years ago. They weren't checking their AEDs, and they had 2 or 3 of them that ended up on cardiac arrest calls, and the AED failed because the batteries were dead, and I think they had a $2 million lawsuit over that. Now, these last 3 things, training, maintaining of training records, and maintaining written records of safety meetings, that's all stuff that your service has to do. So if they do any training, there should be documentation of it. All of those training records, stick them in a folder and a binder somewhere, but just have them in case something comes up. You can show what all you've done for your service. So a couple of scenarios, we'll finish out this one. So you're coming back from a call and a car pulls up beside you and says there's 3-vehicle crash on a nearby interstate. So it's probably high-speed stuff. Nobody's on scene. It looks like there's people trapped, and they don't know how badly they're hurt. So do you think this is the true emergency or not? I would say yes with this, because you just don't know how badly the people are hurt. Now, one of the things that you need to do is make sure you notify dispatch and tell dispatch, and then dispatch will tell you if you should respond. They may have already gotten another call on it. They may already have an ambulance en route to it. You don't want to do something called self-dispatch, where you just respond automatically. So let your dispatchers know, and then if they want you to go, you go. Going down the wrong way on a one-way street, going to a fire, and supposedly there's people hurt. And I think what this slide says, by using the signaling equipment, is we're going to assume that you're in emergency mode. So are you using due regard? And the term due regard is the key here. And there's really not enough information in this slide. Yes, you are legally able, you have an exemption, you can travel the wrong way down a one-way street. It's kind of scary to do. Now, what this slide doesn't say is how fast you're going. So if you're going 5, 10, 15 miles an hour the wrong way down a one-way street, you're probably using due regard. If you're doing like 50 or 60, no, that's way too fast to be going the wrong way down a one-way street. So that would not be using due regard. So you got a call, nobody really knows what's going on, he was too hysterical to give any good information to dispatch. If that's the case, dispatch is probably going to send you out emergency mode because they don't really know what's going on. But while en route, he called back and said, you know what, it's okay, we've calmed down, I think he broke his ankle. And is that really truly an emergency at that point? Do you think that broken ankle is life-threatening or basically disabling to the patient, lifelong disabled to the patient? Probably not. You could have splinted, cast it, whatever, and he'll be fine in a few weeks. So is that a true emergency now? Not really. Unfortunately, dispatch, who talked to the person, probably will say something like, at your discretion, decide whether you want to go down to non-emergency or not. So what will probably happen is, until we get somebody on scene, like a first responder, that calls it back and says you can go non-emergency, we'll probably continue emergency, even though it's not going to make a difference.